let's think about this in the context of a particular oral history. So let's go to the history, the oral history that Lucy Culkin did. We had letters from her, and then about 10 years after her wartime experience, she was interviewed. She and several other people, but she specifically. So was there anything that we learned about Lucy Culkin's experience from her oral interview that we didn't already know and understand from the letters that she had provided?
So I think part of the value of oral history is that it is an oral document, and I say oral, A-U-R-A-L. It is something that you listen to. So we have transcripts, which are important that you read the transcript, but oral histories are meant to be heard. And in listening to the interviews, the kinds of things that you hear in terms of tone, inflection, accent, pauses, silences, they help us understand or help tell us the story in a way like flat text doesn't, right? So that's one thing that I think it brings a kind of richness and emotion to help us understand the past. The other thing, though, I think, and the oral history from Lucille Culkin is really a great oral history to use because we have the archival documents. So again, even as I said, memory may be failing, but then you have the archival documents to kind of speak to or speak with the oral history in really important ways. And so I think that this is a really great oral history to use. One of the things, or a few things that come out, I think, in terms of the oral history is that it helps us fill out the blanks in the papers. So, I think people, when they record, when they write letters or when they take notes, that is a very purposeful kind of recording, right? Now, I don't know that when Lucille wrote her letters, she thought, 50 years from now, somebody's going to read these who I didn't intend for them to read. But she wrote those letters understanding that they would be read. So there is a kind of public performance to the writing of those letters, or she took those notes, and they were extractions of the experience that she was experiencing or responding to. The oral history helps us understand her kind of interior sense or approach to these letters, to these documents. So we hear in oral history talking about her courtship with her husband, right? Now, she doesn't go into details about all of the letters, but we have the letters for that. But she does tell us about their relationship and how she met them, and I think the kind of courtship that they had. And so that's just an example of something that the oral histories bring. I think another really important, or an important insight that the oral history of Lucille Culkin provides are her kind of views looking back on those experiences. In particular, her opinions about the disparities that she experienced. I don't know that she may have took time or to record like, I'm not getting paid as much, or all the women are being categorized as mechanics learners and getting 58 cents an hour. But it isn't until we fought to get reclassified that we got parity, at least with the third class of men. So this is not something that she would have necessarily known at the time that she was creating what is an archival document. It is something that comes with hindsight, where you have distance and you can put your historical experience in a broader context. And that helps us make sense of these archival pieces.
One of the things that struck me when I was reading the transcript was her description of her mother's response when Lucy decides to leave her very respectable job as a social worker and go to work in a factory or in the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
Yes.
And there are two sides to that, where she, on the one hand, says, well, I really wanted to do this for patriotic reasons, but my mother didn't want me to do it. And as she looks back on it, she thinks about the question of what was then thought of as respectable.
Right. That's really that passage where she talks about her decision to work to make this career change or this job change is really interesting for many reasons. One is the response of her mother, and I think her mother becomes a kind of stand-in for a traditional view, which she says her mother had a traditional view. But it's really interesting because she goes on to talk about her father, and she was like, he didn't really say much. And then she says, but he wasn't the dominant voice in the household. So it really throws us for a loop. Here we are thinking that her mother's is like just traditional, but we understand that her household was different, right? And even looking at Lucille's background of having gone to Erasmus High School and then having gone to Hunter College, and it does make her somewhat exceptional in making this decision, and then her reflections after, looking back.
Well, it's the reflection about wearing trousers, which is a kind of mark of a movement into the factory.
And I mean, so she talks about when she talks about some of the experiences, some of the kind of changes or differences she encountered. She talks about having to wear pants, and then there's this whole discussion about, well, did you change into the pants when you got there? Did you? And she was like, I never wore pants. Like, you just never wore pants. She was like, you may have worn shorts in the summertime, but you just never wore pants. And then she's like, but I had to wear the pants when I left work because I had to wear thermal underwear, like long johns, right? So I mean, I think that kind of that moment really gives us a sense of how significant this was.
Yes.
Right? And she helps us understand how significant it was. Now, what's interesting to me is when she's in the panel discussion, and the panel discussion I think happens like a week after the oral history interview. And so it's always important to think about when these things are happening. Her conversations, her comments in the panel are much more kind of like, oh yeah, that happened. They're a lot less filled with the surprise.
Yes.
Right? And part of that is because this conversation is happening in 1989, and women wearing pants is not a big deal, or women working in the workplace is not a big deal. And so I think collectively the women in that conversation are like, oh yeah, it's you don't get the same sense in that conversation of the big deal this was as you do in the first interview with Lucille, right? And that's so one of the things we have to think about oral history is, people, you ideally want to interview people who've never been interviewed before, because what happens is people get kind of practiced at storytelling.
Right, exactly.
And then the story becomes very kind of formulaic and packaged, and you kind of see that difference in tone and in approach. But in the first interview, there's this clear, and wearing pants, and that represented a kind of freedom, and that's conveyed. Another kind of freedom that is conveyed is the loosening of language, the loosening of tongue, right? The ways that women began marking their acceptance from their male coworkers was that these male coworkers felt comfortable using language that they had previously would only use around men.